30 tribes, 6,000 square miles of coastline, 10,000 to 15,000 souls bound under a single paramount authority, and the whole structure appeared, by every historical measurement, almost overnight. The man who built it was born somewhere around 1545. By the time English colonists stumbled ashore at Jamestown in 1607, he had been paramount chief for perhaps 30 years. Empires do not build themselves in 30 years, not without a reason. Behind all of this stands a name every American school child learns. A girl, 11 or 12 years old in 1607. She spoke multiple languages and understood multiple worlds. She died before turning 22 in a town called Gravesend in England in 1617 and was buried as Rebecca Rolfe, a Christian gentlewoman. She is the most mythologized indigenous person in American history, and the genetic story of who she actually was, where her bloodline actually came from, what her DNA would actually show, has barely been told. What has been pieced together does not match the origin story, not cleanly, not comfortably. This is the story of the Powhatan Confederacy, and it begins in a gap. The accepted narrative is a good one. It has weight and depth and thousands of years behind it. The Pamunkey, the Mattaponi, the Chickahominy, the core peoples of what historians call Senecomico, are understood to have inhabited the Virginia Tidewater region for at least 10,000 to 12,000 years. Archaeological evidence doesn't equivocate on this. The ancestors of these tribes were here before the pyramids, before written language, before the wheel. They fished the York River and the James River and the Pamunkey River in patterns that persisted across millennia. By the time of the late Woodland period, roughly 900 to 1600 CE, these communities had developed sophisticated agricultural systems, well-organized trade networks, and complex political relationships. They spoke languages belonging to the Eastern Algonquian family, connecting them linguistically and culturally to peoples all along the Atlantic coast, from the Chesapeake to present-day Massachusetts. They were not isolated. They were ancient, embedded, continuous. The political structure that English colonists encountered in 1607 was built on this deep foundation. Roughly 30 tributary tribes, historians estimate, totaling somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people, were bound together under a paramount chief, a Mamanitowik in Virginia Algonquian. The chiefdom did not descend through the paramount chief's sons. John Smith himself recorded this in 1612. The succession flowed not to Wahunsunakak's children, but first to his brothers, then to his sisters. Power in Senecomico moved through the female line, matrilineal succession. The mother's bloodline was everything. Of all the tribes within this confederacy, the Pamunkey held the most powerful and central position. They were Pocahontas's people. Their reservation in King William County, Virginia, established in 1646, making it one of the oldest in North America, still exists today. The Pamunkey only received federal recognition in January 2016. That is the settled story, and for the vast majority of the people living in Tidewater, Virginia in 1607, it is accurate. Their ancestors had been there for millennia. Their language, their pottery, their burial practices, all of it traces back through the deep woodland period into the earliest peopling of the American East. But Wahunsunakak himself, the man the English called Powhatan, the paramount chief who built the entire structure, is a different question. His origins, and the origins of the chiefly bloodline that produced Pocahontas, are where the settled story quietly runs out of answers. Here is where it gets complicated. Multiple colonial-era sources, oral traditions, and early genealogical records describe the Powhatan ruling family as having come from somewhere else. Not from the ancient Tidewater heartland, where the Pamunkey had lived for thousands of years, but from further south, driven northward into Virginia, possibly within a generation or two before 1607, by forces that may have included Spanish colonial violence along the southeastern Atlantic coast. Wahunsunakak's father, referenced in genealogical sources under the name Running Stream, is described as having arrived in Tidewater, Virginia, and subjugated 5 existing tribes before Wahunsunakak himself extended that conquest to 30. This matters genetically in a way that cuts directly to Pocahontas' DNA. Mitochondrial DNA, Think of it as a molecular diary passed unchanged from mother to daughter, generation after generation. Tracking only the female line is one of the primary tools geneticists use to trace ancient population movements. It works like a surname encoded not in writing but in the body itself, immune to the reshuffling that happens when DNA from two parents combines. In Eastern Algonquian populations, the founding maternal lineages, the mtDNA haplogroups that define the deep ancestry of the Tidewater peoples, cluster predictably within the Pan-American founding groups, A2, B2, and related subclades, all tracing back to the original Beringian crossings 12 to 20,000 years ago. The Y chromosome lineage, the paternal line, tells a largely compatible story for the general population. In Eastern Algonquian-speaking groups, Y DNA haplogroup QM3 is dominant, consistent with deep Native American ancestry. Researchers studying ancient Algonquian populations note that the mtDNA and Y DNA profiles, taken together, paint a picture of relatively stable, long-established populations across the eastern woodlands. But, and researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty, when a ruling lineage arrives from outside an existing population and marries into it, the mtDNA of the chiefly line reflects where the mothers came from, not where the population they governed had always lived. The Powhatan succession was matrilineal. Pocahontas inherited her genetic identity, in mitochondrial terms, through her mother, through her grandmother, through the women of the chiefly bloodline whose origins no colonial record ever documented. If that bloodline entered Tidewater, Virginia from the south within a few generations of Pocahontas's birth, her mtDNA may not trace to the 10,000-year Pamunkey continuum at all. The women who made her who she was, genetically, are absent from the historical record entirely. The first theory says this is not actually an anomaly, it is a pattern. Wahunsunakak was a locally born Algonquian leader who inherited authority over the 6 core tribes of Senecomico through standard matrilineal succession, then expanded via military conquest and strategic diplomacy between roughly 1570 and 1607. His family's southern origins, in this reading, are simply the memory of a previous generation's geographic movement within the broader Tidewater-Carolina continuum, a normal feature of Algonquian political history, not evidence of a distinct foreign ancestry. The linguistic evidence supports this. The Powhatan language, the tongue Pocahontas grew up speaking, the one Captain Smith struggled to learn, is unmistakably Eastern Algonquian, closely related to Delaware. Language doesn't lie about deep ancestry. And the archaeological record along the Pamunkey River confirms continuous occupation going back thousands of years, long predating any hypothetical arrival of a chiefly family. Helen C. Roundtree, the leading scholarly authority on the Virginia Powhatan and author of Pocahontas's People, 1990, argues that the Confederacy was an organic political development, a chiefdom built by a man of exceptional ability from the materials already present, not the imposition of a foreign ruling class onto a conquered population. The rapid expansion, 6 tribes to 30 within perhaps a generation, mirrors patterns seen in other pre-contact North American chiefdoms, where a single powerful personality could reorganize political geography almost beyond recognition within a lifetime. The limitation of this theory is precise. It explains the expansion. It does not easily explain the gap. It does not explain why genealogical and oral records specifically describe the chiefly family as newcomers to the Tidewater region rather than its original inhabitants. And it cannot account for what was happening in the decades just before Wahunsunakak's rise along the Atlantic coast to the south. The second theory is more complicated and significantly more disturbing. In 1561, a Spanish colonial fleet operating along the Atlantic coast seized a young man described as a lord of the Chiskiak people, almost certainly, in the words of historian Camilla Townsend, a cousin of Wahunsunakak, if not a nearer relation. He was taken to Spain, educated by Dominicans, lived among the conquered Aztecs in Mexico, and was baptized under the princely Spanish name Don Luis de Velasco. In 1570, he returned to the Chesapeake Bay region as an interpreter for a Jesuit mission led by Father Juan Baptista de Segura. Within months, he abandoned the Spanish entirely. In 1571, he led the massacre of the entire mission, 9 Jesuits killed, the Spanish colonial presence on the Chesapeake destroyed before it ever fully established itself. Don Luis, Paquiquineo, then disappeared from Spanish records. He returned to his people, and his people, if Townsend's identification is correct, were Wahunsunakak's family. This places Wahunsunakak's kinship network in direct contact with Spanish colonial activity spanning from Florida to Mexico, at precisely the moment his family appears to have been consolidating power in Tidewater, Virginia. The Spanish colonial presence on the southeastern Atlantic coast, in Florida, in the Carolinas, in the Chesapeake approaches, was violently disruptive throughout the mid to late 1500s. It destroyed communities, it displaced populations, it created refugees, and sometimes conquerors, out of people who had nowhere else to go. If Wahunsunakak's founding family was pushed northward into Tidewater, Virginia by this disruption, arriving after 1550, subjugating existing tribes, and building Senecomico in approximately 1 generation, then Pocahontas's maternal lineage does not belong to the 12,000-year Pamunkey story. It belongs to a lineage that arrived in living memory of her birth, carrying whatever genetic history it had accumulated further south, in territories the Powhatan origin story has never accounted for. The limitation here is also precise. The connection between Paquiquineo and Wahunsunakak's family is inferred from timing, geography, and kinship naming patterns. No surviving primary source confirms it directly. The data doesn't confirm it. It only fails to rule it out. The third theory, and the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, pushes further still. If the chiefly bloodline that produced Pocahontas spent decades moving through the southeastern Atlantic corridor before arriving in Tidewater, Virginia, it moved through a zone that had already experienced generations of contact with Spanish colonial and Atlantic trade networks. Spanish ships had been working the Florida and Carolina coastlines since the early 1500s. Enslaved Africans had been present in Spanish Florida since 1526. The genetic mixing that would later be called admixture, and that would, 3 centuries later, be weaponized against indigenous people by Virginia's eugenicists, may have already begun in the population stratum that produced Pocahontas's maternal ancestors, not as a consequence of English colonization, but as a precondition of it. This cannot be proven from the current evidence. Researchers are careful to frame this as a hypothesis the data hasn't ruled out, not a conclusion the data supports. But it produces an extraordinary irony that deserves to be named. The state of Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act in 1924. Walter Plecker, the registrar of the Bureau of Vital Statistics, immediately used it to reclassify virtually all Virginia Indians as colored, overwriting birth certificates, marriage records, and death certificates going back decades. He declared in writing that there does not exist today a descendant of Virginia ancestors claiming to be an Indian who is unmixed with Negro blood. His campaign was later called a paper genocide. The Pamunkey, the Mattaponi, the Upper Mattaponi, Pocahontas's own direct descendants found themselves bureaucratically erased. But the 1924 Act contained one exception. It was called the Pocahontas Clause. White Virginians with 1/16 or less of native blood and no other non-Caucasian ancestry could remain legally white, specifically to protect the prominent Virginia families who claimed descent from Pocahontas and John Rolfe. Pocahontas's name was embedded into a white supremacist law as a protection for white people. The chiefly bloodline that Plecker called colored was also the bloodline the law specifically exempted from being called colored, as long as it was diluted enough and held by the right families. What the law buried, the genome is only beginning to unearth. You are standing at the edge of the York River in the winter of 1607. The air is cold, the way Virginia cold always is, not the bone-cracking freeze of further north, but damp, gray, penetrating, the kind of cold that settles in your lungs. The water moves slowly under a thin shelf of ice at the shallows. The smell is river mud and wood smoke and the faint salt of the estuary downstream. You are at Werowocomoco, Wahunsunakak's capital, on the left bank of the York River. Behind you, a longhouse large enough to hold hundreds fills with firelight. Somewhere inside, the Mamanitowick is being prepared to receive a captive English soldier named John Smith. Near the fire, at the edge of the proceedings, a girl watches. She is 11 or 12 years old. She is called Amonute, though she has a private name, Matoaka, that she guards from strangers. The English will later give her a nickname, Pocahontas, and that nickname will outlast everyone in this room, outlast the Confederacy, outlast the language, outlast the river's old name. She carries something in every cell of her body that no one in this room can see, and that no one in the entire subsequent history of her name will think to look for until centuries have passed. A genetic lineage. Her mother's bloodline, and her mother's mothers, stretching back through the chiefly succession, through women whose names were never recorded, whose origins were never asked, who moved through a history that was already being erased before it was ever fully written down. She doesn't know she carries it. Neither do the English. Neither do the historians. Neither does the state of Virginia, which will one day enact a law with her name in it, not to protect her descendants, but to manage the inconvenience of her. The genome remembers, even when everyone else decides to forget. This is the part the records don't explain, and the part where the story's cruelest irony comes into focus. The single most consequential act of genetic erasure in Pocahontas' story was not the arrival of the English in 1607. It was a law signed in Richmond on March 20th, 1924. The Racial Integrity Act required every Virginian to be recorded at birth as either white or colored. Walter Plecker, who led the Bureau of Vital Statistics from 1912 to 1946, immediately began reclassifying Virginia Indians. He changed birth certificates. He changed marriage certificates. He changed death records. He pressured school superintendents to reclassify children. He ordered the exhumation of people from questionable cemeteries. He built lists of Indian surnames and distributed them across the state bureaucracy as targets. In the 1930 U.S. Census, Virginia recorded 779 Indians. By 1940, that number had collapsed to 198. That is not demographic decline. That is not assimilation. That is a data deletion. The people were still there. The genome was still there. The record was gone. And then the law created the Pocahontas Clause. Prominent Virginia families, many of them white, many of them wealthy, had spent generations claiming descent from the 1614 marriage of Pocahontas and John Rolfe. These families needed their native heritage acknowledged enough to be historically prestigious, but not acknowledged enough to make them colored under the new law. The solution was a carve-out. Anyone with 1/16 or less of Native American ancestry and no other non-Caucasian blood could remain legally white. The clause was named explicitly after Pocahontas. The Pamunkey tribe, Pocahontas' own people, who had held their reservation since 1646, was not protected by the Pocahontas Clause. They were classified as colored. Their identity as Indians was struck from official records for decades. Plecker's reclassification made it impossible for 6 of Virginia's 8 state-recognized tribes to achieve federal recognition because they could no longer produce the unbroken documentary chain of Indian ancestry that recognition required. The Pamunkey did not receive federal recognition until January 2016, 400 years after Pocahontas' people first made peace with the English at Jamestown. A Pamunkey elder, speaking at a tribal gathering in the years before that recognition finally came, described what Plecker had taken from her community not as records, but as mirrors. "You cannot see yourself," she said, "in a document that says you were never there." The law used Pocahontas' name to protect white claims to her bloodline, while systematically destroying the records of her actual living descendants. The DNA that Plecker most feared, the complex, layered, traveled genetic truth of what the Powhatan chiefly line actually was never sequenced. The paper trail that would have guided geneticists to the right families, the right maternal lineages, the right haplogroup comparisons, was deliberately burned. What happened to Pocahontas' ancestry is not a footnote in Virginia history. It is a template. Wherever a government had reasons to control who counted as a particular ethnicity, the records were shaped accordingly. Wherever the political stakes of ancestry were high enough, the documentary evidence was managed. DNA does not care about those reasons. The genome does not honor the Pocahontas Clause. It does not distinguish between a family whose Indian designation was protected and a family whose Indian designation was struck. It carries whatever it carries, indifferent to the laws made around it. Pocahontas has been many things in American memory. She has been a Disney princess. She has been a symbol of peaceful coexistence between cultures that were anything but peaceful. She has been the Pocahontas exception in a white supremacist law. She has been a political insult. Every version of her served someone else's agenda: the romantic colonizers, the eugenicists, the politicians, the myth-makers. None of those versions required knowing who she actually was, genetically, molecularly, ancestrally. The genome requires that, and the genome is the one version of her story that cannot be rewritten by a man with a pen and a list of surnames. The Powhatan were never what we thought. The DNA, patient, indifferent to myth, preserved in the bodies of living descendants that a 1924 law tried to make disappear, is only now beginning to tell us what they actually were. And the question it leaves open is not just who Pocahontas was. It is what it means that we spent 4 centuries building stories about her ancestry, while the people who carried that ancestry in their own cells were being told, by law, that they did not exist. That question does not have an answer yet. The archive is still being rebuilt, one genome at a time.